Today we're talking about Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, a story of justice and redemption. Now, this is one of my favorite reads of this year so far. Bryan Stevenson works on death row, mostly with people who are wrongly accused, hence why he works for them. The book goes back and forth between following the story of Walter, one example of someone who was wrongly accused, perhaps the most impactful and most meaningful case that Bryan worked with, and it goes back and forth between that, and then the other chapters cover, they're more nonfiction. They cover like certain aspects of the criminal justice system that he sees problems with, or even other short stories of cases that he's dealt with. It's really interesting the way he lays it out. I want to use this video, use your time to cover some of the highlights of this book, some of my favorite moments for people who either aren't going to read it but want some of the interesting information, or for people who have read it who can say, oh yeah, I liked that too. There's just so many interesting little things in here. This book taught me so much for being what it is. First of all, I tried to write what I thought was the main message of the book on the first page, and that is that abstraction is comfortable, but personal encounter is meaningful. Well, what do you mean by that? I mean that when people aren't numbers and statistics, but actual people that you interact with on a regular basis, or at least in some kind of more meaningful way than just looking at their names on a graph or a chart, they become much more significant, and their struggles become much more compelling. C.S. Lewis touched on this in That Hideous Strength, where the main character, Ransom, the main character in that book is not Ransom. I can't remember his name. The main character in that book, he is a sociologist, and he, over the course of the story, comes to recognize the value of real relationships with people and viewing people within that context as opposed to seeing them as statistics. The first highlight is about the only country to send children to prison for life. Oh yeah, the U.S. is currently the only country, the only developed nation who sends children to prison for life. The other highlight on the same page is that 1 in every 15 people born in the United States in 2001 is expected to go to jail or prison, and 1 in every 3 black male babies born in this century is expected to be incarcerated. When I first read this, I was going around citing that 2001 statistic all the time, because I was born in 2000, and I have lots of friends who were born in 2001, so I was going around giving them a hard time and just kind of showing them how alarming the situation is. The next highlight is about spending on prisons in the U.S. Spending on jails and prisons by state and federal governments has risen from $6.9 billion in 1980 to nearly $80 billion today. The next highlight is about what followed Jim Crow. This is a note because I wanted to do more research on it. It says the brutal era of sharecropping and Jim Crow was ending, but what followed was persistent unemployment and worsening poverty, which is the reason I wanted to do more research on it, is because it's kind of a vague claim, but also that you would expect poverty to improve, not worsen. Oh, this is interesting. The next highlight is about forced sterilization. It says, having criminalized interracial sex in marriage, states throughout the South would use the laws to justify the forced sterilization of poor and minority women. Forbidding sex between white women and black men became an intense preoccupation throughout the South. The next highlight is about life on death row. On death row, prisoners are, I'm paraphrasing, locked in a small cell by themselves for 23 hours a day and are held in disturbingly close proximity to the electric chair. The next highlight is titled White Jury, Black County. Apparently it's common practice for legislators in the South to maintain white majorities for judicial circuits that include a majority black county. The next highlight is just titled Overriding Jury Sentences. Since 1976, judges in Alabama have overridden jury sentencing verdicts in capital cases 111 times. In 91% of these cases, judges replaced life verdicts from juries with death sentences. Come on, judges. What are you doing? This next highlight sounds very pretentious and elitist, just the way that I wrote it down. Mitigation narrative dependence. Ooh, what does that mean? I don't know, big words. A client's life often depends on his lawyer's ability to create a mitigation narrative that contextualizes his poor decisions or violent behavior. Something that we all know, but that is a little bit concerning when you put it out loud like that. The next highlight is death penalty for kids. I didn't mean to laugh at that. It just caught me off guard. Only a handful of countries permitted the death penalty for children, and the United States was one of them. When? It's been a while since I've read this. It's been like a couple months probably. Maybe 1 or 2 months. It doesn't say what year this was. I can't remember when that story took place. It was either the 80s or way more recently. The next highlight is origins of victim advocacy. This is interesting. 50 years ago, the prevailing concept in the American criminal justice system was that everyone in the community is the victim when an offender commits a violent crime. In the early 1980s, states started involving individual crime victims in the trial process and began personalizing crime victims in their presentation of cases. I'm just reading the highlighted parts. 36 states enacted laws that gave victims specific rights to participate in the trial process or to make victim impact statements. In many places, prosecutors started introducing themselves as the lawyer representing a particular victim rather than as representative of the civic authorities. In death penalty cases, the U.S. Supreme Court said in 1987 that introducing evidence about the status, character, reputation, or family of a homicide victim was unconstitutional. The court prohibited jurors from hearing victim impact statements because they were too inflammatory and introduced arbitrariness into the capital sentencing process. Such evidence could disempower poor victims or victims who were racial minorities or family members who didn't have the resources to advocate for their deceased loved ones. I'm having to get out of the highlighted part for it to make sense in a sentence. Less than 3 years later, the court reversed itself in Payne versus Tennessee. Victim services and outreach became critical components of the prosecutorial function. Some states made executions more accommodating of victims by increasing the number of people from the victim's family who could watch the execution. The next is Predictor of Death Penalty in the U.S. I have a feeling this is going to be depressing. Mccluskey V Kemp, a case that presented convincing empirical evidence that the race of the victim is the greatest predictor of who gets the death penalty in the United States. Black defendant and white victim pairings increase the likelihood of a death sentence even more, and the expansion of victims' rights ultimately made formal what had always been true. Some victims are more protected and valued than others. This is not my good side. My face probably looks like a blob. Hope you guys are enjoying that. I'll skip that one. It's not that important. That was like I'll look at this later highlight. This one is Incarcerated Childbirth. See, if you just read like the names of the highlights, this would be even more concerning, I feel like. It wasn't until 2008 that most states abandoned the practice of shackling or handcuffing incarcerated women during delivery. Nearly 500 people in Pennsylvania who have been condemned to mandatory life imprisonment without parole for crimes they were accused of committing when they were between the ages of 13 and 17. And that is the largest population of child offenders condemned to die in prison in any single jurisdiction in the world. This is Conditions for Juveniles in Adult Prisons. See, this book is full of just shocking facts. That's why I want to share this with you guys, so that you don't have to read it to get these facts, because it's jarring. Juveniles housed in adult prisons are 5 times more likely to be the victims of sexual assault, so the staff of Appalachia, I think that's how it is, put Ian, who was small for his age, in solitary confinement. Ian spent 18 years in uninterrupted solitary confinement. This is Criminal Records for Poor Children. In poor urban neighborhoods, random stops, questioning, and harassment dramatically increase the risk of arrest for petty crimes. Many children develop criminal records for behavior that more affluent children engage in with impunity. The next one is Mental Institutions in the 1950s. This is fun. Have you seen BoJack Horseman? Watch it. In 1955, there was one psychiatric bed for every 300 Americans. 50 years later, it was one bed for every 3,000. Can you imagine one bed for every 300 Americans? People would just send in their wives and their brothers and their cousins who they didn't like. Prison for the mentally disabled. The inability of many disabled, low-income people to receive treatment or necessary medication dramatically increased their likelihood of a police encounter that would result in jail or prison time. In fact, there are more than 3 times the number of seriously mentally ill individuals in jail or prison than in hospitals. In some states, that number is 10 times. This is defamation standard. New York Times v. Sullivan changed the standard for defamation and libel by requiring plaintiffs to prove malice, that is, evidence of actual knowledge on the part of the publisher that a statement is false. That's kind of a little tangent, little side note, not quite as shaking. This one's about women on death row. The child victim category resulted in a tremendous increase in the number of young mothers and juveniles who were sent to death row. In fact, nationwide, most women on death row are awaiting execution for a family crime involving an allegation of child abuse or domestic violence involving a male partner. Next one's about infant mortality in the U.S. This is pretty commonly known now. It was kind of seen as a really big deal a couple years ago, but we don't talk about it so much anymore, even though it's still a big deal. Despite America's preeminent status among developed nations, we have always struggled with high rates of infant mortality, much higher than in most developed countries. The inability of many poor women to get adequate health care, including prenatal and postpartum care, has been a serious problem in this country for decades. The next highlight is about welfare restrictions. In 1996, Congress passed welfare reform legislation that gratuitously included a provision that authorized states to ban people with drug convictions from public benefits and welfare. In the last 20 years, we've created a new class of untouchables in American society made up of our most vulnerable mothers and their children. That's the thing. If you don't have personal connections with people who can help you, if you don't have a personal support system, and you can't reach out to the state for help because you broke the law at some point, who are you going to reach out to? Who's going to help you? If you really need that support, who's going to help you? Somebody has to. If we're a compassionate society. This next highlight is about the birth of the prison industrial complex and about lobbying for prisons. In the 1990s, when America was opening prisons at a pace never before seen in human history, between 1990 and 2005, a new prison opened in the United States every 10 days. Never before had so much lobbying money been spent to expand America's prison population, block sentencing reforms, create new crime categories, and sustain the fear and anger that fuel mass incarceration than during the last 25 years in the United States. The last 25 years, so since 1994. The next highlight is juveniles are ellipses. They are the products of an environment over which they have no real control, passengers through narrow pathways in a world they never made. Who was that quote from? Oh, that quote is from Bryan Stevenson, or at least from his firm. Last highlight, lethal injection trafficking. This is crazy. Oh my goodness. This chapter is crazy. Read the book, please. Here, I'll read this full paragraph. Following the Nelson litigation, questions about the drug combination that most states use to carry out lethal injections arose. Many states were using drugs that had been banned for animal euthanasia because they caused a painful and torturous death. The drugs weren't readily available in the United States, and so states had started importing them from European manufacturers. When the news spread that the drugs were being used in executions in the United States, European producers stopped making them available. The drugs became scarce, which prompted state correctional authorities to obtain them illegally without complying with FDA rules that regulate the interstate sale and transfer of drugs. Drug raids of state correctional facilities were a bizarre consequence of this surreal drug dealing to carry out executions. The U.S. Supreme Court in Bays v. Rees later held that the execution protocols and drug combinations were not inherently unconstitutional, and the executions would resume. Why were we never talking about this? That's crazy. What year was this? Come on, book. Tell me. 2004. I was 4. Maybe you guys were talking about it. That's crazy. here, this isn't even a sticky note highlight, but just a regular highlight. But this is, I guess, a higher note to end on. Mercy is most empowering, liberating, and transformative when it is directed at the undeserving.